Hi, I'm Nick Haig, and welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast. Dan Davies is a former economist at the Bank of England and stock analyst for a number of investment banks, as well as being a journalist, writing for the Financial Times and the New Yorker. He's the author of Lying for Money, and his new book, The Unaccountability Machine, is about the way in which a rising proportion of our society is run by systems, algorithms, and AI rather than people. Dan is recognised for his insights into how business markets work, and his motto is, if you don't make predictions, you won't know what to be surprised by. In this messy world we now live in, I can't wait to hear what Dan predicts for us in the future. This is very much a podcast for the current times. If you like what you hear today, then follow and subscribe wherever you watch or listen. We really do appreciate your feedback and your following. Welcome to the World's Greatest Business Thinkers podcast, Dan.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, I just had to invite you. Actually, it was on the back of speaking to Rory Sutherland that he mentioned your name and he mentioned your book, and he said he'd like to hear you as a guest on the podcast itself. So,
no, he's a fantastic guy.
Yeah, no, he is. So delighted to have you on. And I've given a little bit of an introduction, but if we could start today by you just expanding on your career as an investment banker and economist and how that shaped who you are today.
Well, I was kind of a weird kind of investment banker, basically. I was lucky enough to have some very understanding bosses who just let me get on with doing the things I did and were extremely tolerant of me being kind of abject when it came to spreadsheet modeling. And I was responsible for the bank sector because I'd been an economist in the regulation department of the Bank of England beforehand. And then, me and the civil service decided that we were going to carry on and look for success in different directions. I knew my career at the Bank of England was going nowhere when someone suggested that I might be good at being the regulator for prepaid funerals in the United Kingdom. When you get that kind of thing on your annual review, you know it's time to leave. And so I was a specialist in something called regulatory capital securities, which are strange bonds issued by banks to make their regulatory capital requirements, which tend to have lots of funny legal structures in them, so that most of the time they behave like bonds, but in a crisis, they behave like equity. And so my job was all about let me range out of equilibrium situations in which things happened that people weren't expecting. And, it really kind of suited me because I've always liked funny little corners of documentation. I've always thought that you learn a lot more about the system when it's in trouble and when it's not going well, rather than when it's performing excellently. Wow. And so I just went along reading my funny little legal documents and researching situations. And most of the time I was barely earning my salary. And then every 3 or 4 years, a banking crisis would blow up and I'd make a ton of money. And I was, as I say, lucky enough to have understanding bosses who realized that they had to keep me around because when everything, although I was bad, when everything went to hell, I didn't get any worse. So that was my investment banking career. I was at Credit Suisse at a time when that was a thing that you could be much more proud of. I was at BNP Paribas. I was at a lot of UK banks that don't exist anymore. And then around 2014, I decided that I'd had as much fun as I was going to have in the investment banking industry, made a bit of money. So I moved out of London and started doing what I always wanted to do when I was a kid, which was to write books.
Yeah. And as I said, you've written a previous book, Lying for Money, but today we're going to be talking about the unaccountability machine. So you're an investment banker turned economist by profession, and you spent your working career looking at the economy. But over that time, you've fallen out of love with economics. Why is that?
Let me fall out of love with it is a good description, actually, because what I think ended up frustrating me is that economists just somehow at some point gave up thinking about the economy. It became all about applied maths. Some of it very complicated, some of it very useful, all of it, quite an intellectual achievement. But you look at things in economics journals these days, and half of them you're thinking, this doesn't really have anything to do with the economy. One thing that I really did notice when I was a banker is that when you're talking to an economist, the higher the economics degree they've got and the better the quality of the economics program that they did, the more sure you can be that you're talking to someone who cannot open and read a set of accounts. The not only is accountancy not a compulsory kind of thing to learn on most economics degrees, which I personally think it should be, it's often not an option either. If you go to Oxford or Cambridge University and you want to learn accountancy, you're going to have to find an online course because it's simply not taught there.
Right. Yeah. And I think you talk about the same about, in this perfect world where they're looking to model, they lose sight of things like leadership and advertising and marketing too. It's not...
the whole advertising. This is something Rory's very funny about. The whole advertising industry basically doesn't exist in economics. There's no useful theory of one of the world's a massive industry. Advertising, marketing, and media. The science of economics has almost nothing to say about it because they make simplifying assumptions. One of those simplifying assumptions is perfect information, and of course, if everyone's already got perfect information about anything, they don't need to consume media. They don't need to be advertised to. They already know it all, which is. Yeah. It's understandable, and I still have lots of good friends in economics who gently tease about this all the time. But at this point, you've got to admit, in my view, that what you're talking about is just a mathematical system that you've created to talk about with your friends and colleagues. It's not talking about the economy. It's not talking about the real world anymore.
Yeah. Well, there's a term as well in economics, isn't there? The Ricardian vice.
Yeah.
This tendency to create and test theories that are oversimplified, unrealistic, and I think from your book it came through clear. Economists tend to believe or reduce everything to this single goal, which is the shareholder value maximization. But we'll obviously get onto that later on.
Yeah,
in the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and it wouldn't be any difference because if you're actually trying to say something mathematical about something as complicated as the economy, you've got to simplify things. And, supply and demand are a good way of starting to think about lots of questions. Economics kind of optimization is a good way of starting to think about things. The trouble is that kind of over the years, we've started treating it as the only way to think about things. So, you get a kind of idea of what's going on. And then, as you say, the Ricardian vice, you stop thinking. You presume that you've got all the answers. And that was what ended up frustrating me with the subject of economics. That is what then made me end up thinking there's actually got to be more interesting ways to understand the world than that.
Well, your latest book called The Unaccountability Machine on the shelf behind me. Did writing this book come on the back of being a bit more disillusioned with economics?
Actually, it came out of two other books that I worked on, one of which was my previous book called Lying for Money. And when I was writing that, it was about the history of financial fraud. I came across this concept called a criminogenic organization. And it was invented by a bank supervisor in the USA called Bill Black, who was dealing with the savings and loan crisis, which was a massive wave of fraud that went through the Americans' savings bank industry. And he just noticed that there were some organizations which were set up in such a way that crimes were going to be committed because of the incentives and the management structures that they had. And that interested me because it was something I thought, well, maybe you can generalize that. Maybe you can say that there are sort of bad decision-ogenic organizations that are just set up in such a way that although people in them know that things are going wrong, or although people working in them have some intentions about what they want to achieve, the way that the system is set up guarantees that a result will come out that nobody wants. When I was writing the first draft of the book, my title for it was going to be Decisions Nobody Made, because I got this feeling that we're living through a whole kind of almost an era in which we're living with the consequences of decisions, but all of the people who we think made those decisions completely deny responsibility for them.
Yeah.
And the other big influence on it was that I happened to get lucky and meet through my agents a guy called Will Butler Adams, who is very interesting. You should have him on the pod if although he's so busy, he says no to almost all these things.
Right.
And he's the chief executive of Brompton Bikes. We wrote a book together about his company and about his management style. And it was very interesting the way that he always put the emphasis. He basically said, we're not a company that builds bicycles. We're a company which builds systems that allow people to build bicycles. He kind of was saying that all of the time in a company, you're trying to reduce as CEO the number of decisions you have to take yourself because you want the thing to be able to run itself and for you to make the decisions that make a difference. And I thought that was, he's a super interesting guy, and I learned a huge amount from just kind of listening to the way that he thought about these things and thinking, this is actually how companies work. They're in general systems set up not to kind of maximize the individual control of the CEO, but to minimize the number of decisions that the person in charge needs to make.
Yeah. Well, as you rightly say, Dan, when we look at the world today, there's fewer and fewer decisions that are being made by individuals. And the subtitle of your book, Why Big Systems Make Terrible Decisions. And in this age of AI, anxiety and institutional mistrust, it's quite interesting to see that these machines that we should fear the most are actually the ones we've already built, such as these corporate behemoths and large government bureaucracies. So these large organizations, they're vast, they're complex, interlocking systems, and nobody quite understands it. So let's start at the top. Why is this a problem for society, especially around being accountable for decisions that are being made?
Probably these are artificial intelligences, and this is kind of an idea that lots of people from science fiction writers to computer science professors have kind of independently reached over the last couple of decades. That let me you kind of think of what are the criteria for calling something an artificial intelligence. Then it's something which is not itself human, but which takes in information and makes decisions. So actually, if we're worried about big artificial non-human intelligences taking over the world, the time to start worrying about it was probably in the 18th century with the East India Company. The time to start really worrying about it was probably the modern corporation in the United States after the Second World War. They are artificial intelligences in the sense that they're non-human and they make decisions, but they are artificial intelligences which were not designed. They've grown up and they've evolved, and like anything which has gone through a process of evolution, it's developed habits and tendencies which reflect the kind of reward and survival system it grew up in, rather than any kind of concept of rational design. So a guy like I had a really interesting conversation with Rory Sutherland about this a few months ago. That he's all about behavioral economics and behavioral psychology, and all of these strange biases and tics of decision making that human beings have, and ways that they behave irrationally. Organizations are exactly the same, because they have, like human minds, developed through evolution rather than design. They have strange tics and sort of ways of making decisions that don't really make sense. And this is a problem, particularly because this is something that's happened very recently. If you look back to, say, even as recently as the 1920s, so less than 100 years ago, you can read biographies of companies and stories about companies like Getty Oil or wherever, and it's very clear from John Paul Getty's autobiography that he made all the decisions at Getty Oil. He would get a report on every single rig every single morning and then issue his orders for what to do. These days, the chief executive of BP or ExxonMobil or whatever can't possibly have that level of control over their company. It's just too big and just too complicated. And so what we've got is, a slogan that I didn't use in the book, but I've started kind of using it when I'm talking about these things, is it's the industrialization of decision making. So let me think of managers or kind of leaders in political terms as people who make decisions, but they don't make decisions any more than someone makes knives and forks these days. 100 years ago, your tableware or your kind of the glasses and plates in your kitchen would have been made by an individual person. These days, they're the outputs of a cutlery making machine. The operator of that machine doesn't look at your knives and forks and say, I made those. They didn't. They just operated the machine that made them. Increasingly, people in leadership positions are seeing themselves as the operators of an industrial decision-making machine. And that's, firstly, a huge cultural leap for the rest of us to make, to understand that this person's actually only one of the operators of the system, rather than someone who makes decisions in the way that you or I do in our normal life. But also, it's that process of industrialization affects the decisions themselves, because as with industrial production of goods, the way that you industrialize a process is to simplify it and standardize it and reduce the range and variety of things that can be produced. When you do that to knives and forks, you don't really mind that you're not getting a handcrafted, artisanal product in which everything's different. When you do it to decisions, you're actually doing something quite dangerous, because you're restricting the sorts of things that the system can think about. And you're often doing that in a way, firstly, that you never really planned how you were going to restrict that information and what you were going to choose. But secondly, you're not necessarily designing the system in such a way that it can respond to changes in the environment. And that's how you get organizations going crazy, because organizations go crazy when the world changes, but they don't have any means of knowing that, because they've decided that they're going to pay attention to a particularly small subset of their information. And as I say in the book, the most obvious example of that is the one, again, that Rory always goes on about, which is companies that have decided to manage themselves purely by their financial accounts.
Yeah. Well, and I think that you say in your book, don't you? Companies don't have motives, but there is this imbalance between what they're created to do and the short-term goals versus the long-term goals. And in today's world, where everything's a profit-creating machine, if you can make money today, then you might not exist in the future. So profit's driving all these different decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's this great slogan the purpose of a system is what it does. And it's one of the kind of fundamental kind of analytical principles of information theory, cybernetics, which we can maybe talk about in a little while.
Sure.
But what it's saying is that the company doesn't have any motivation necessarily, but if it pays attention only to financial metrics and it only kind of changes its behavior in response to financial kind of results, that's what it does. That's its purpose. There's no point in saying that the purpose of the company is to do anything else if it doesn't respond to information about anything else.
Yeah. Well, the result is, as you talked about, Dan, these inherent complexities, lack of transparency, and it leads to this catastrophic, in some cases, decision making. There's lots of examples in the book, but what's your favorite example from the book of how a terrible decision was made due to such opaque systems in place?
I think the clearest example is the Boeing 737 MAX. And everyone who looks at this, is horrified at the kind of process by which Boeing, which was a company with, firstly, an incredibly strong reputation for safety, second, a company that had a famous engineering culture in which things were always done right, turned into the kind of organization that could put out the 737 MAX, a fundamentally flawed aircraft that had a problem that caused it to crash and kill people. And this was entirely due, as far as we can tell, to the merger, which basically ended up being a reverse takeover with McDonnell Douglas. Whereas McDonnell Douglas had a very aggressive finance-driven culture. The accountants and the kind of financial managers at McDonnell Douglas very quickly took over the entire organization at Boeing because they were the ones who seemed like they were being rational. They were the ones who were always able to arrive at meetings with a load of spreadsheets with what looked like objective numbers about cash flow and costs. And the Boeing guys were always going to the same meetings saying, well, this isn't how we do it. We need more quality here. We've got concerns about safety, but not necessarily things that they could quantify in the ways that were being rewarded by the market. As a result, they ended up outsourcing a large part of their manufacturing and design process. And when you create that outsourcing relationship, I've worked in the outsourcing industry for the last 10 years with one of my friends with a sort of small company that provides analysts to banks. And one thing I've learned is that part of the cost of an outsourcing relationship is the amount of resource that you have to dedicate to communication and making sure that information still flows back and forth in the same way that it did when that was an in-house operation.
Yeah.
Instead, what Boeing did was get basically a bunch of lowest tenders for, mission critical, safety critical parts of their invention. And what you end up is getting exactly what I would call a bad decisionogenic organization. Nobody in Boeing wanted to design a aircraft that had so many design compromises that, show-stopping safety critical flaws were inevitable.
Yeah.
For some reason, the incremental effect of decisions that were aimed at maximizing quarterly earnings reports created an organization in which it was only a matter of time before something like that was going to happen. In financial terms, it turned out to be, even in its own terms, it turned out to be the biggest financial disaster that could possibly have happened to that company, and it killed several hundred people in the process. It's a really kind of frightening example of what happens when a company forgets what it's for, or when a company decides it's going to ignore things that previously it had considered to be absolutely crucial to its mission in favor of concentrating on a very small set of financial metrics.
Well, I mean, similar to that, Dan, I used to run an agency, an independent organisation, and so when I ran it, as an independent, we were very much marketing led, knowing that we were spending money on marketing in order to build a brand to reap the benefits further down the line. And when we were then merged with a larger, more complex business, we had to then meet, their shareholder expectations every quarter. So we had to live more hand to mouth, and therefore restricted with our marketing budget. And because we were only ever judged on our quarterly numbers, thus not investing for future growth. And of course, that catches up with you and leads to problems, that quickly catch up. And I suppose Jack Welch and his time as CEO at GE is a great example of this, where he always hit his quarterly numbers for his shareholders. He was finessing the financial accounting figures, wasn't he, by managing cost as opposed to growing the revenue. In fact, he was called Neutron Jack, wasn't he? Because he made prize or redundant, leaving buildings empty in their wake.
Yeah, absolutely. And the trouble with these things is that the accounting numbers are just they're fiction. There's always this great joke that much more fiction has been written with Microsoft Excel than has ever been written with Microsoft Word. And if you ever talk to accountants, which I would thoroughly recommend. I once went to the annual dinner of the Scottish Chartered Institute of Scottish Accountants. That was quite a party. And, all these numbers are compromises. Nearly every number in the accounts is an assumption, which is treated as a fact. When I've done training with accountants, which I sometimes do, I always tell them that every single page of a set of published accounts has a lie on it. And the biggest lie in any set of accounts is the numbers at the top of each column, which are the dates. Because if you put 2024 fiscal year at the top of a column, you are implicitly saying 12 months is the relevant time period over which you should be measuring the performance of this company, which is true by purest chance, one time in 1,000. Yeah. It's sort of that could be, might want to be looking at 3 weeks. You might want to be looking at 5 years. Yeah. And it's fine to do it that way. You have to have a set of accounts because you have to record and summarize the transactions, as long as you know that that's what you're doing to yourself, as long as you don't start fooling yourself that those numbers are the reality. Because if you fool yourself that those numbers are the reality, then your information universe shrinks to what's contained in those numbers, and you start doing things like cutting the marketing budget. I've been on the other side of that kind of relationship. When I was a banker, I had a boss that used to look over all of the credit card receipts for every month and call you in for a bollocking if you haven't spent enough. He always said, there's two kinds of lunch. You have lunch that you pay for and lunch that the client pays for. And the difference between them is that the client pays a lot more for the lunch that you pay for.
Well, this brings us nicely to the accountability sink, which you describe as a structural policy within organizations that deflect responsibility, thereby diluting individual accountability. Initially, when I read this, I thought, how can this be so? A decision that nobody owns, nobody makes. But the more I thought about it and the more I read the examples in your book, the more it brought it home that these accountability sinks are everywhere. To what extent is an accountability sink designed, and to what extent is it an emergent property of this complex system we're talking about?
Well, let me give an interesting question to ask about any particular case that you find yourself in. So, the accountability sink that kind of sticks in my mind is the Stability and Growth Pact of the European Union. Well, this is the rule that fiscal deficits in the EU have to be kept below 3%. And, that's a rule that's had huge consequences. It darn nearly blew up the entire system in the 2010s. It caused untold kind of havoc in the economy of Greece and of Italy. And so how did the number 3% get picked? The answer is that they picked 3% for the European one because that was the number that was already being used in the French fiscal rule. Let the number 3% get picked for France? And the answer is that back in the 1980s, at the start of the Mitterrand government, someone walked into a particular economist's office and said, I've got all these ministers asking me to spend money. I need to tell them that we have a rule for how big the deficit can be. You've got to give me a number that sounds good and sounds like it comes from an economist. And the guy just said, well, it's already at 2%, so there's no point in me picking a number below 2. Yes, and 4 seems like it will be a bit high. And then he apparently said, and 3 is a good number. It reminds you of the Holy Trinity. People like things that come in 3s, and therefore the number will be 3%. The whole discussion took less than an hour in 1982. It's still here in 2025. And the reason for that is that if anyone had stood back and said, shall we pick a number? What's the justification? What's the best number? They would forever be identified with that decision. And so it's much easier to just pick the thing that's come before, because that way you don't have to take responsibility for changing anything. And things like that are intentionally created ways of avoiding accountability for people who just feel like their job is tough enough without having to always kind of be held accountable for mistakes or be forced to justify decisions.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, though, these things just emerge because the world is incredibly complicated. We can't all have individual artisan-made dishes and plates and knives and forks in our houses. And we can't all, unfortunately, have made artisanal, individually crafted decisions either. Sometimes we have to take the output of the industrial decision-making machine and accept that we're going to be subject to that. Now, the trouble is that most of these industrial decision-making machines have been built without any feedback. I ended up concluding that the big problem of accountability is just that there's no systematic building in of feedback from the real world consequences of decisions to any levels of the model where you can get them changed. And I think anyone who's been involved with a large organization or the government or the education system has come up against these horrible situations where you feel like you're talking to someone who looks like a human being and is roughly the size and shape of a human being, but you're not having a human conversation. All the things that are actually coming back to you are policies. They're the outputs of this mutual intelligence in the organization, and there's no, it's all output from them. There's no, your input is just being kind of, it's like, it is a joke in organizations, like one of the rudest things that you can say to someone is, we value your input. Because what you mean by that is, I have listened here to what you've said, and I'm not completely going to forget it and ignore it. And that happens to people more and more, and it's kind of psychologically intolerable. And I think one of the things, as I say in the book, one of the reasons that we've seen a lot of the social and political craziness that we've seen over the last couple of decades is that if you keep treating people like that over a period of time, they go a bit mad. There's nothing worse than not being listened to. As anyone who's kind of brought up a child or been in a bad relationship will tell you, there's nothing worse than feeling like you're not being listened to.
B2B Frameworks is a curated collection of proven business frameworks to develop your strategic thinking skills, solve your biggest business problems, and unlock your next promotion. Our mission is to help you achieve these goals. We want to create the next generation of successful business leaders by providing the tools and frameworks needed to create effective strategies that drive business growth. Each framework comes with a downloadable set of instructions with large, colourful diagrams and editable templates to guide you through the process step by step and prompt you to consider the problem from every possible angle. Along with audio guides and educational tools, our extensive content library is full of real-world examples and case studies of strategic thinking in action. So why learn with B2B Frameworks? We've carefully curated only the most effective, proven business and marketing frameworks. Our downloadable materials and audio guides will help you easily apply each framework. And the insights and advice you'll find across the site are based on 30 years of consulting experience from one of the world's leading business strategy experts, Paul Haig. B2B Frameworks is a small investment to advance your career or grow your business. Start your journey to becoming a successful business leader by joining B2B Frameworks today.
You'd think as well that companies would want customers to give advice and feedback because I suppose because they're overwhelmed by feedback, they can't do anything with it by design, so they design the system not to get that. I mean, an example actually while I was reading the book, Dan, is I've written books on customer service, and it frustrates me no end. Firstly, when you can't find a phone number to contact if you have a problem, or just a generic email that seems to go into an abyss. But when you do get hold of a human being, you end up going in circles, and the computer says no. We know all about that. But I recently signed up for this 2-year ticket deal with Co-op Live, a music venue here in Manchester, and they didn't deliver to my expectations in the first year, so I didn't go to all the allotted gigs, and then they weren't flexible in carrying over the gigs I was owed from year 1 into year 2. So the problem I faced is that even when I got to speak to the upper echelon of management through email, they just came back and said, we have this policy in place, and if we change it for you, we need to change it for everyone. So in the end, just reneged on the contract and backed out. But I knew in my heart of heart, they could have made a different decision, but they were just taking the easy way out and blaming the system. It's so frustrating.
It's frustrating because, companies really do need to design themselves so that they're not overwhelmed and so that they can take on board this information. Again, I keep coming back to it was an excellent lunch I had with Rory Sutherland a few years ago, and we came up with, a few months ago rather, and we came up with this slogan, which is customers live in the real world. So, you as a decision maker, as a CEO of a business, with the best will in the world, you don't really live in the real world. You live in the world of reports and abstractions and information that's carefully curated for you. And so you're making decisions about this kind of shared mental object that you and your direct reports have, and hoping that those are not going to be too disastrous when applied to the actual reality of the organization you're managing. So you don't live in the real world. The customers do live in the real world. And the consequence of that is that a company that's set up to pay attention to its customers cannot drift too far from reality, because it will get information that something has changed, or it will get information that it's doing something wrong. A company that is set up to manage on the basis of its financial accounts or on the basis of some other kind of reporting system can drift a very long way from reality before something happens, which, usually something quite disastrous happens, which kind of brings it back into contact with the fact that it started doing some very strange kind of things.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Rory was a guest on the show. In fact, on the podcast, he talked around that, and he actually mentioned that people in the CX or customer experience role should be the best paid people in the company because they're closest to the customer and therefore able to make the biggest transformative changes based on their knowledge, as opposed to those people that are in the ivory towers.
Absolutely.
On accountability, it seems like it's a ubiquitous problem wherever we look. How are we going to solve this problem, Dan? Is that why management consultants are everywhere?
Well, I mean, management consultants give like financial because like estate agents or human resources people, there's a lot of transferred guilt. There's a lot of stress that people feel and management consultants are someone that you can blame it on, someone that you can have as a scapegoat for all of your other problems. When they are at their best, management consultants are the people who look at an organization and look at its flows of information and what it's doing and what it's paying attention to, and they really can help you solve those problems. The trouble is that as corporate doctors, they prefer to be Dr. Feelgood. They prefer to prescribe solutions that cost a lot of money and don't help the patient get well, because that's the way that they get repeat business. But if you get a good management consultant, stick to them and pay their invoices, because a good one can be worth their weight in gold. I think the things that people need to do are just to be conscious of the information that they are using and the information that they're ignoring. Because, in this limited world, every decision you make about what you're going to pay attention to is de facto a decision about what you're going to ignore or deprioritize. People need to respect that with their financial structures, because one of the big things that we need to talk about a little bit is debt. Which is just simply, we've been talking for the last kind of half hour about how you shouldn't pay too much attention to financial metrics. Unfortunately, if your company is indebted, then you have to pay attention to financial metrics, because you have to know how you are making those payments. This is something that Will Butler-Adams, Brompton, has always been very clear about and explained to me in detail. Every time you take on debt, you give up control. And you give up, in many ways, more control when you take on debt than when you sell equity. Because if you have a shareholder, then they have votes. They might have a seat on the board, but you can talk to them, you can have a conversation with them. If you take on debt, then you get left alone as long as everything's going well. But you don't care about that when everything's going well, because everything's going well. When things go bad, if you've got debt, then suddenly you've got someone who makes demands and who is much more difficult to negotiate with. And so, the more you use debt, the more you will find yourself being restricted in the amount of information that you can take on. But the most important thing is to have those links between the ground reality of the business and the decision-making levels. I refer to them a little bit in the book as the red handles. So you've got the red handle in a train driver's cabin. And that is, I got corrected on this by some train guys actually. It's not something he pulls, it's a dead man's handle. So you let go of the red handle when stuff goes bad. These ways, I would say that red handle is mainly an organizational tool. It has the physical probability that it's a brake which stops the train. But of course, if you only stop one train and keep running the rest of the railway as you were before, then that's a bad thing to do. That's something you definitely shouldn't do on a railway. Something's bad's going to happen. The red handle sends a message to the whole organization that the timetable has to be rewritten for that day. Normally, a single train driver isn't allowed to rewrite the timetable. The red handle is their communication channel, which says something bad has happened, something has happened which will have unacceptable consequences for the entire organization unless decisions are taken right now to make serious changes. And that's a kind of signal that's often absent from organizations. And it's the absence of that kind of signal that makes people think of them as unresponsive or unaccountable, because there's just no way of getting that message through from the effects of the decisions back to the system that was responsible for making them. So that, I think that's the number one thing I would be asking people to look at, to just how the feedback loop works from the consequences of decisions to the right level of decision making that's capable of changing those decisions.
Well, that brings me nicely on. We've already mentioned it today in the discussion, Anne, but this feedback loop and the fact that we do have some hope, everything is not lost, because we can try and re-engineer the problems we face today with something called cybernetics. So what is cybernetics, and how can this help us get greater clarity on these complex systems we've created?
Cybernetics it's an old-fashioned word these days, because we have the Cybermen in Doctor Who, we had cyber security, cyber sex even, and originally what this was it was a branch of applied mathematics developed out of Second World War work, and it is basically information theory applied to problems of control. So cybernetics is the science of designing feedback loops so that a system is capable of attaining stability. And we actually have a concept that is slightly one level higher than stability. What you want from a system is something called viability, which is stability plus the ability to restore a stable state after a shock which was not anticipated when the system was designed. So a viable system is one that is capable of restructuring itself or changing its behavior or kind of changing the way that it operates in responses to unanticipated changes in the environment.
Right. Yeah. Well, much of the mathematics that sits behind the cybernetic thing is way beyond my limited brain capacity. But essentially, I saw it as this art of management founded on a science of organization, in that there's this relationship, there's a system, inputs, outputs, and then these feedback loops that influence their behavior. And this podcast is sponsored by B2B Frameworks, and you state that there's this 5-tier framework of cybernetics that all organizations should follow. Can you run us through this model?
Not really economics. You have a lot of complicated maths in the background, but the basic concepts, a supply and demand are something that anyone can get their head around, even if they don't necessarily want to go through the whole kind of axiomatic derivation of the curves. The basic idea is that information has to balance. So the information balance sheet has to balance in the sense that at every point in the organization, you have to make things manageable. You have to ensure that the amount of variety and information that's coming into a decision-making kind of node is not greater than the capacity of that node to process information. It's the subject of every management science book that's worth the paper it's written, is just how you manage complexity, how you stop yourself from being overwhelmed by the tide of information that kind of flows into any organization on any day. And the way that management cybernetics, kind of a guy called Stafford Beer, who is a wonderful 1960s hippie management consultant who was hugely influential on David Bowie, of all people.
Yeah.
So set up the system is that you have the operations. So first system, part of the system is the operations, the part of the system that deals with the external world, and which could, in principle, be a viable system in its own right. You have a second regulatory system, which is all of those things which are meant to stop the operations from getting in each other's way. So if you think of a school, then you have a timetable, which is a system for making sure that people don't try to teach different lessons in the same classroom at any one time. And so you have a bunch of those systems to try and support the operations. You then have what they call kind of optimization or kind of line level management, where you're trying to direct the operations and to optimize their performance in the here and now. So that's the level which deals with issues raised by the operations in terms of new information that's coming in that they need to deal with there and then. And that's kind of where too many organizations stop, because that is a system that will be stable but not necessarily viable. And organizations that have only those feedback links will go okay until they reach an unanticipated shock.
Yeah.
In order to deal with unanticipated shocks, you need two more systems, which is kind of interesting. It's not just one. You need a research and intelligence function that is dedicated to monitoring the environment outside the immediate kind of operations. Usually that function is looking at things which are outside the immediate scope because they don't exist yet. So it's looking kind of out into the future or out, into the wider environment. But you have to balance the change that is kind of needed in response to new shocks with the ability of the organization to change. You can't constantly be reorganizing, or you just lose kind of organizational structure. On the other hand, you can't stay rigid, or you kind of won't respond to external shocks. And so you have the highest kind of, not highest in the sense of an organization chart, but as in the higher levels of consciousness, almost. I told you this guy was a hippie. You have the function of balancing present and future. And that function of balancing present and future is in many ways the identity and sort of the soul of the company, because that's the decision that you make on the basis of what is this organization for? What is the purpose of this organization? And that will determine how you respond to new information. And, as we said earlier, how you respond to new information is, it's the closest thing that an organization has to a motive. Companies don't have motives, but they do have systematic and structural ways that they respond to changes in the environment. And that's something which, if you don't design it consciously, it will just emerge from the interactions of the people working in the organization as they try to deal with kind of change, on the basis of what appears best to them locally. And that emergent property might be something that you completely did not intend. Yeah. So kind of the five stages of the system are kind of operations, timetable-like kind of regulations, line management day-to-day, intelligence, and then this fifth system, which is the philosophy for dealing with the purpose of the organization.
Yeah. I mean, with this framework in place, you state that there are two ways to manage the organization, and this is through attenuation and amplification. Again, can you expand on what you mean by this?
Yeah, and this is where the information theory kind of comes in. So, as I said, the basic kind of purpose of cybernetics and the main law of motion of the system is that everyone's got to be able to deal with the information that's being presented to them. And since, in general, you have massively more potential information, that the world generates so much information, and we can barely deal with it kind of a couple of emails every 10 minutes. Yeah. You either have to attenuate the information that comes in, and by that I mean you have to choose to ignore large amounts of this information as not being relevant to your purpose. And, that's something that we all do. The only people who try to pay attention to every single piece of information in front of them are babies, and they get tired and cranky pretty quickly by trying to do it. So Information attenuation is always happening, but it should be happening by design. You should be intentionally deciding what you're going to pay attention to and what you're going to ignore. The other way that you deal with an imbalance between your capacity and the information of the world is by amplification, and that might be by doing something like writing down a policy. So if I say, all kind of sales interactions of this form will take place according to this process, then I might have spent like an entire day designing that process, but once I've done it, I can hand it off to my employees, and I've amplified my own ability to deal with those kind of cases because I've written down the instructions ahead of time and done that. Of course, like any amplifier, you're amplifying the noise as well as the signal. So again, you need to be, firstly, doing that intentionally, and secondly, anytime you amplify your management ability by writing down a policy or creating a system, part of the cost of doing that is setting aside the budget for dealing with the exceptions to the system. And that's something which organizations often fail to do. And that's how they end up with, I would say in many ways, an accountability sink is kind of a misdesigned amplifier. It's something which where you've created that kind of way of amplifying your own capacity, but you've not budgeted for the feedback link for dealing with the fact that when you amplify something, you lose some of the fidelity.
Yeah. Well, so we've been talking about large, complex organizations, whether they're corporates or governments. And well, I suppose with what I look into the future, the digital revolution has accelerated pace of change like no other. It's making it more crucial for businesses to adapt. And we've been talking about this failure to adapt, haven't we, today? So all large businesses do become sluggish. We know that when they get to a certain size. And back to Jack Welch, who we've had today already, he said, when the rate of change inside an institution becomes slower than the rate of change outside, the end is near. What do you predict that the future holds for these big, complex businesses, and what role will AI play in the future? Will it be this game changer that everyone's talking about?
If you look at the history of the companies, you see that what happens is always following the same pattern. Complexity tends to increase exponentially because as you add more things, the number of connections between things goes as a multiple. So you've got exponential growth there. Your capacity to add resources to deal with that complexity is usually linear, and then every now and then you get a technological revolution which gives you a step up in your ability to process information. So, the telegram system made the railroads possible in the USA. Is the classic historical example. So things like AI, if you view it as a new way of processing information, it gives us one of those technological leaps up. It gives us the ability to deal with, summarize, attenuate, and amplify our information processing capability. But exponential growth versus linear growth only ever has one winner in the end. And we're already seeing that AI can be used to create complexity and to create junk information, as quickly as it can be used to process it.
Yeah.
And so, this has happened many times before. What always happens is that companies reach a point at which they are no longer manageable because they have become too complicated. And at that point, they restructure. And the way that they restructure is that they either spin off parts of themselves or they delegate more operational independence to their to units which were previously managed from the center. And typically, and this is true of government as well, that kind of delegation is the measure of last resort, because letting go of control feels horrible and no one likes to do it. So they only do it after they've tried everything else, and they only do it after things have got really too serious to ignore. But I think that's what's going to happen, simply because that's what's happened roughly every 20 years since the Second World War, in the development of corporate structures.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I mean, we could go on. There's so much to cover in the book, but
I could go on more than you could. Think I could. I feel.
But I mean, to conclude, to bring this to a finish, I have some usual questions that I'd like to talk through. So, Kirsten Ferguson, she's an award-winning author and named as one of the top management thinkers in the world today. And her latest book is called Blind Spotting: How to See What Others Miss. So I spoke to her last, and her question was, in terms of, if we look, if we look to the future, or if we look to the past, what are the key blind spots that people did miss that made some of these terrible decisions? Could you name one of them that is a key blind spot that really caused all these terrible decisions to be made?
The blind spot that we missed is that we presumed that debt was a relatively neutral means of investing capital, and we ignored what Will Butler Adams pointed out to me, which is that debt is actually an exchange of control. And specifically, when you start using more debt in corporate structures, you're passing a lot of control to someone who doesn't have the right incentives and who actually doesn't want to be using that control in the interests of the company. So, yeah, I think a lot of this is the last 20, 25 years have been that people just looked at debt in an economics spreadsheet equilibrium sense and didn't consider enough all of the nasty little cases that I made my career out of when things happened that nobody wanted, and you have to find a way out of them, at which point you quickly begin to understand that having a lot of debt makes all of your problems more difficult.
Yeah. And a question from one of the listeners, Serena Reynolds from London, asked, do you think we're outsourcing too much decision-making to systems that weren't designed to carry ethical weight?
I mean, I think that's actually a very good slot from which I might kind of pinch for publicity for the book. I mean, I think the trouble is that we're outsourcing too much decision-making to systems that weren't designed at all. And we're outsourcing our decision-making to systems that just grew up as the result of lots of little decisions on our part that we were going to design a policy or make a process and kind of hand it off. And we never realized that when you keep doing that again and again and again, you're creating this huge decision-making system that's now responsible for most of the interactions of your organization with the world. And, it wasn't designed to carry ethical weight, but because it wasn't designed at all.
Yeah. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever been given?
Yeah, well, I'm an old London Business School grad, so I'm going to say the best piece of advice was from Professor John Kay, which is simply, not all business problems have solutions.
Yeah.
Or, as one of my old bosses on the trading floor said, sometimes, Dan, all you can do is sit down and lose your money.
So you've already said previously, earlier in the podcast, Dan, but who would you like me to reach out to invite to come on the podcast in the future?
Well, I think if you can get Will, that would be great. I'll certainly pass on his details. Really interesting thinker, really interesting guy who took over a company that had, serious case of founder syndrome and made it into, kind of the global brand it is today. Particularly interesting to me because it seems to me that smart people with engineering training almost always reinvent a lot of information theory and cybernetics when they're put into management roles.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I'll definitely take that recommendation and that lead. And finally, my next guest is Tom Fishburn, CEO of Marketunist. He's been making people laugh with his cartoons for over 20 years, capturing marketing industry insights. What question would you like to pose to Tom?
As someone, as you can tell from my accent, also from the Northwest, with that kind of culture, I'd like to ask does he think that jokes ever change someone's mind? Because, there's a lot of us who kind of communicate in that way. And I think it's often you get your message across pretty quickly if you're kind of slightly sarcastic or jokey. I'm wondering, someone who's doing that professionally, do you ever actually change someone's mind that way?
Yeah, great question.
Because it's a question I don't know the answer to, and I'd like to know.
Yeah, well, I'll pose it to him, Dan. Well, thanks so much for today, Dan. It's been an hour of discussion. Thoroughly love the book. I mean, it's insightful. I feel like I'm looking at the world through fresh eyes now. And at the end of the book, you list further reading section. And I know there's a lot of research that needs to go into writing any book. But you've certainly done the heavy lifting for us mere morsels with this book. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
One thing we know for sure is that the world's always changing, and technology and AI is impacting the world like never before. Important decisions are going to be made by robots, so we better get used to it. But management cybernetics might help us to create a future by design. So, like you say at the end of the book, I blame the system is something we probably all need to get used to saying in the future.
Thank you very much. It's been really interesting, really great discussion.
If people are interested, Dan, in learning more about cybernetics or your books, of course, how should they get in touch with you?
Probably the best place is through my Substack these days, where I'm kind of writing about general sort of thoughts on management and science, and where I'm gradually working up the proposal for the next book, which is going to be about crises, and that is called backofmind.substack.com.
Excellent. Well, I do subscribe to that, and there's some excellent thoughts and articles and literature that comes out to that. So thanks for that, Don. And thanks again for today, and an excellent discussion.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thanks very much for inviting me.
This podcast has been brought to you in partnership with Awards International. Awards International is dedicated to running successful business awards programs and conferences. Founded in 2008 by Don Hales and Neil Skihel, the company's core mission centers on honoring and celebrating exceptional achievements in customer and employee experience, but also in overall business excellence across diverse sectors. In addition, their aim is to showcase best practices, innovations, and achievements that contribute positively to these areas, ultimately inspiring other organizations to improve their own customer experience, employee engagement strategies, and overall business success. To find out more about Awards International and how to register your interest in their awards programs, check their website www.awardsinternational.com.